A villager in the Greek mountains wrote in a school notebook with a pencil worn almost to wood. The Germans left. The flags changed. The guns never went silent. It was October 1949, high above a valley in northern Greece. From his window he could see terraces of stone-walled fields, olive trees bent by wind, and the burned skeleton of a house that had never been rebuilt. The occupiers had gone 4 years earlier. The swastika banners torn down. The Wehrmacht columns retreated north. The last German patrol had vanished over the ridge in late 1944, but the war had not ended. It had only changed uniforms and slogans. Before the war, villagers like him had understood politics as something distant. King, parliament, parties in Athens all arguing in newspapers. No one in the mountains read. Power arrived, if at all, as tax collectors and gendarmes. The mathematics of survival were simple. Enough wheat to last the winter, enough goats to breed another year, enough sons to work the land. Then October 1940 came. Italy invaded from Albania. Greece, expected by many to crumble, did not. In his village, the news of Greek resistance came late, carried by breathless messengers and distorted by rumor. Men listened to radios hidden under blankets for fear of informers even then. "The Italians are stopped," someone shouted in the cafe. "Our army pushed them back into Albania." For a brief moment, there was pride. Posters appeared in towns showing Greek soldiers kicking caricatured Italians down mountain slopes. Priests spoke of a new 1821, of resisting invaders as their grandfathers had resisted the Ottomans. But pride had its own arithmetic. Italy's failure drew in Germany. In April 1941, German divisions attacked from Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. Within weeks, the Hellenic army was broken. German paratroopers took Crete after brutal fighting. Occupation followed. The villager. His name was Giorgos, though his interrogators and partisans would call him other things, watched as German trucks growled up the mountain road past his family's fields. Soldiers in grey and field green disembarked in the square, helmets sharp, boots polished even in mud. They requisitioned houses, barns, livestock. They posted proclamations in stiff, official language on the walls of the church. Any attack on German forces will be punished by the shooting of hostages. For every German soldier killed, 50 Greeks will be executed. The numbers were not metaphors. They were policy. Hunger followed the armies, not by accident. German economic planners, calculating how to feed their own troops and cities, treated occupied Greece like a storehouse to be emptied. Grain, oil, meat, whatever could be seized, was shipped north. In Athens and Piraeus, famine stalked the streets by the winter of 1941-42. Corpses of starved civilians lay by the roadside in the capital, collected by carts like refuse. In the mountains, the impact was slower but inevitable. The Italians, assigned large areas of occupation, were harsh but often disorganized. Black markets flourished beneath their noses. Partisans moved more freely. The Germans were something else. Systematic. Precise. Giorgos remembered the first reprisal. A German patrol had been ambushed in a gorge a few kilometers from the village. 2 soldiers killed, 1 wounded. Leaflets appeared the next day, dropped from trucks and shouted in broken Greek. "Those who shelter bandits will be treated as bandits. Bring us names, or we will take lives." No names came. Not enough, at least. So the Germans chose randomly. 20 men from nearby villages lined against a stone wall. Giorgos watched from behind a cracked shutter as a priest tried to bless them before German officers shoved in the way. The shots were methodical. 1 volley, then a second for those still moving. The lesson was clear. Resistance had an exchange rate measured in blood. One German life, 50 Greek lives, sometimes more. Yet resistance grew. In the high ranges, under snow-capped peaks, guerrilla groups formed. ELAS, the armed wing of the communist-led National Liberation Front, built networks of supporters. EDES, a smaller Republican resistance group, also took shape. The occupiers expected bandits. What they encountered, especially in the mountains, were peasants like Giorgos, learning the mathematics of guerrilla war sabotage, ambushes, hurried retreats. He watched as boys he had known since childhood vanished into the hills with rifles older than they were. They returned bearded, dirty, eyes hollowed by cold, speaking of daring raids on German convoys, of bridges blown up, of weapons parachuted in by British agents. They also spoke of reprisals, villages burned, whole populations shot or herded away as bandit collaborators. These were not abstractions. One morning in 1943, German forces accompanied by collaborationist security battalions arrived in a neighboring village. They accused the inhabitants of aiding partisans. In a few hours, the houses were in flames. Whatever could burn, burned. Giorgos saw the smoke from his fields. He and his family hid in a cave, listening for engines, praying the column would turn back. It did not, then. But they knew now that their lives depended on decisions made kilometers away, in ambushes and meetings they never saw. By 1944, the German grip loosened. Soviet advances in the east, Allied pressure in Italy, and the D-Day landing stretched Wehrmacht resources thin. Garrisons pulled back. The occupiers no longer marched as conquerors. They moved like men crossing a minefield of hatred. In October 1944, German forces withdrew from most of Greece. Local collaborators, members of pro-Axis militias, and those who had grown rich from occupation scrambled to choose new loyalties. The swastikas came down. The Greek blue and white flag rose over town halls. In the mountains, partisans emerged from caves and forests, rifles slung casually over shoulders, greeted as heroes by some, feared by others. On paper, liberation had come. In reality, another war began. The seeds of that war had already been planted during occupation. Resistance was never unified. ELAS and EDES clashed as often as they cooperated. Ideologies hardened under pressure. Communists envisioning a radically transformed Greece, monarchists and conservatives wanting the return of the king and the old order. British liaison officers, parachuted into the mountains with radios and money, favored anti-communist factions. Soviet support, limited and cautious, nodded toward Greek communists, but offered little concrete aid. Occupation had turned villages into networks of competing loyalties. Giorgos kept his head down as best he could. He gave bread to whoever arrived armed at his door. German soldiers, Italian carabinieri, ELAS fighters, EDS men, royalist militias, as long as they did not shoot him. Each group remembered. Each kept lists. When the Germans left, those lists were opened. In the first chaotic months after liberation, so-called people's courts sprang up in some areas under ELAS control. Collaborators, real or alleged, were tried and shot. Names that had once been whispered now filled charges: informer, black marketeer, German translator, betrayer of partisans. In Athens, the return of the exiled government with British support triggered another set of calculations. The king hovered in the background. British troops landed, ostensibly to maintain order. In December 1944, fighting broke out in Athens itself between ELAS forces and British-backed government troops. For villagers like Giorgos, the Battle of Athens was distant thunder, but its implications reached even the highest hamlets. It signaled that the question of who ruled Greece was not settled. The occupiers had changed. The struggle for power had intensified. By 1946, the simmering tensions ignited into full civil war. On one side, the government in Athens, supported heavily by Britain and, later, the United States. On the other, the Democratic Army of Greece, DSE, formed largely from remnants of ELAS and other leftist fighters, drawing strength from parts of the countryside and support, to varying degrees, from neighboring communist states. The hills and gorges that had hosted resistance against Germans now hosted battles between Greeks. Giorgos's village became, in effect, contested territory in a new front. Government patrols climbed the stone paths, uniforms, a mix of old royalist insignia and newly issued boots stamped with American lettering. They demanded to know who in the village supported the bandits, the communist fighters. They posted notices warning that aiding rebels meant prison or execution. Weeks later, DSE fighters descended from the high ridges. They, too, demanded cooperation. "You fed the Germans once," one of them said quietly to Giorgos in his courtyard, hand resting on his rifle. "You will not make that mistake again." The mathematics of fear, already complicated under occupation, became almost unsolvable. Whom to obey? Whom to lie to? Which lie would get you killed faster? The Germans had punished resistance in multiples of 50. The new conflict added subtler punishments: exile, denunciation, the disappearance of sons in opposite directions. One of Giorgos's nephews, angry and idealistic, joined the DSE, convinced that the monarchy and its backers would return Greece to pre-war injustices. Another nephew, more cautious, enlisted in the government army, lured by a steady wage and the promise of land reform and stability. The family dinners that had once been noisy with jokes and songs became tense, political, then impossible. The nephews vanished into different parts of the same mountains, perhaps firing at each other someday without ever knowing. Guns crackled in the distance almost every week. The villagers learned to distinguish sounds: the chopping rhythm of an old machine gun, the flatter crack of new American-supplied rifles, the distant boom of artillery echoing off granite. In 1947 and 1948, as the Cold War hardened, the civil war in Greece became one of its first proxy battlegrounds. American advisors arrived, replacing war-weary British officers. The Truman Doctrine poured money and weapons into the Greek government's hands, framed openly as a line drawn against communist expansion. For Giorgos, this meant more soldiers on the roads, more leaflets dropped from planes denouncing the bandits, more pressure to prove loyalty to the state. At the same time, DSE units received support across the northern borders: arms, safe havens, political training. Each side claimed to be the true Greece. Each side claimed to defend the nation from betrayal. Each side called the other traitors and foreign puppets. In the mountains, the hurt was more intimate. "I have lost track," Giorgos wrote one evening, "of which side burned which house. I only know that it was a Greek hand that struck the match." The war's brutality accumulated in small, local arithmetic. A village suspected of DSE support, 5 men taken away by government troops, 2 returned, 3 never seen again. A hamlet used by the army as a base, hit at night by guerrillas, 1 officer killed, 3 houses burned in retaliation. Women bore particular burdens. Some were forced by DSE units to join support networks, cooking, carrying supplies, nursing fighters. Others endured screenings by government forces, suspected of hiding sons or husbands. Stories circulated of forced recruitment, boys and girls taken from villages to be sent north for political education, to one day return as hardened cadres. In reality, motives blurred. Some left enthusiastically, seeking escape from grinding rural poverty. Others left in chains. By 1949, the government army, heavily supplied and advised by the United States, had gained the upper hand. Air power and artillery made mountain strongholds less safe. Yugoslavia, once a vital supporter, closed its border after Tito's split with Stalin, isolating the DSE. The last major guerrilla forces were crushed in battles near the northern frontier. The civil war officially ended. The casualty figures told one story. Rough estimates: 40,000 or more dead in the Civil War, on top of the hundreds of thousands lost during occupation through famine, executions, and combat. Tens of thousands imprisoned. Many tens of thousands more fleeing into exile to Eastern Bloc countries, never to return. For villages like Giorgos, the end of open fighting did not bring clarity. Loyalties declared under duress could not be easily taken back. Old neighbors who had supported ELAS or the DSE with food and shelter now faced an emboldened state intent on rewarding friends and punishing enemies. In the early 1950s, loyalty certificates became passports to a normal life. To get a job in the city, to hold a government position, even sometimes to send your children to certain schools, you were asked, had you ever supported the left? Were you a nationally minded Greek? Giorgos, who had fed whoever came to his door with a weapon, now found his wartime pragmatism read differently depending on who asked. Government officials in Athens and in provincial capitals did their own mathematics of the past. Some offences were unforgivable, being a known communist leader, having served openly with the DSE, having killed local notables. Others could be blurred or forgotten if convenient. Minor collaboration during occupation, quiet profiteering, staying passive while neighbors were arrested. The new state, like so many after Civil War, needed stability more than purity. Men who had worn German-approved uniforms in occupation now wore police uniforms, having simply traded badges. Their records, if read at all, were interpreted through a new lens, their anti-communist credentials. The calculus of guilt shifted. Under occupation, the worst crime had been to support the Germans. Under British influence, the worst crime became to threaten the monarchy. Under American pressure, the worst crime was to be a communist. Nowhere in these equations did the villagers' dead get proper accounting. The burned house at the edge of Giorgos's village, destroyed by German troops in 1943 for partisan activity, remained a skeleton. The sons killed in the Civil War lay in different graves or in unmarked pits on windy ridges. The nephew who had joined the DSE never came back. Rumors placed him in some distant Eastern Bloc factory town, a political refugee, safe but exiled, his Greek citizenship revoked by a state that labeled him a traitor. The other nephew, who had served in the government army, returned with a limp and a silence that lasted for years. He rarely spoke of what he had seen or done. He had fought for order, he said. Beyond that, nothing. Giorgos, who had survived both occupation and civil war by crouching in caves and giving bread to whoever knocked, found that his village now existed in a new, uneasy peace. In the early 1950s, Greece entered the Western Alliance system more firmly. Marshall Plan aid had already begun to repair roads, build power plants, modernize ports. Athens grew. Tourists returned to the islands, drawn by ruins older than any modern conflict. The government spoke of progress and national unity. In the mountains, progress arrived in slower increments. Electric light, a new school roof, a radio in the cafe broadcasting American music and state news. On the radio, politicians used words like reconstruction, development, democracy, defense. They rarely used words like Decembriana, Macronisos, executions, mass graves. Macronisos, the island prison where thousands of leftists had been re-educated under brutal conditions, was not mentioned when tourists admired the Aegean. The Civil War in official memory became a bandit war, reduced to the story of heroic national forces defeating foreign-inspired rebels. The German occupation, too, was remembered selectively. Tales of resistance were celebrated, tales of collaboration were buried. Giorgos listened to these narratives and felt a familiar dissonance. He knew peasants who had joined guerrillas not out of ideology, but because German soldiers had shot their fathers. He knew men who had collaborated not out of conviction, but because it offered their families extra rations. He knew boys who had died in DSE units chanting slogans they barely understood. He knew soldiers who had suppressed villages with American rifles in their hands and tattered Greek flags on their sleeves. The official stories had no room for such messy motives. The Germans left, he wrote in his notebook years later. They took their flags and their language of orders with them. The next men who came spoke Greek. They spoke of king, of people, of party, of nation. But always, behind the words, there were guns. By the late 1950s, a strange quiet settled over much of Greece. Not real peace, but fatigue hardened into custom. People married, planted, emigrated to Germany or America in search of work, or to Australia, carrying with them memories they seldom shared with their new neighbours. Children born in those years knew the war only from fragments. A scar on an uncle's leg. A burned farmhouse no one rebuilt. A grandmother weeping quietly on a certain date each year. A father's sudden anger when someone mentioned those in the north or those in government. History textbooks in schools spoke of the heroic resistance against the Axis occupation, then moved quickly to the communist bandit threat and the restoration of order. Occupations, famines, mass executions, civil war, each reduced to a few pages. The real curriculum lived in whispered stories at night, or in the silence where stories should have been but were not. Giorgos aged. His hands, once strong enough to carry sacks of grain and bundles of firewood through snow, stiffened. He worked less in the fields, more in the courtyard, fixing tools, watching the road. Sometimes, tourists passed now, backpacks on shoulders, eager to see traditional villages, unaware that the stones beneath their feet had soaked up more blood in one decade than in the previous 100. They admired the terraced hills. They photographed old men in caps playing cards outside the cafe, calling it picturesque. They did not see the bullet scar in the cafe wall where, in 1943, a German officer had shot a man as a lesson. They did not know that, in 1948, a DSE group had stormed that same cafe, looking for a rival faction member they said was a traitor. The land remembered. The people chose, collectively, how much to recall. Some clung to partisan songs, to anniversaries of battles against the Germans, to the memory of red flags on mountain peaks. Others polished medals from the government army, told stories of American planes bringing supplies, of saving Greece from communism. Between them, men like Giorgos kept their notebooks hidden. His simple sentence: the Germans left. The flags changed. The guns never went silent. Captured the essence of his life from 1940 to 1950 better than any official speech. The occupiers had taught him that foreign flags could be hauled down. The Civil War had taught him that when a society turns its guns inward, front lines run through families, not maps. The Cold War would teach Greece that alliances could be changed like uniforms, from Axis to Allied, from British influence to American, from isolation to NATO membership. For the villager in the Greek mountains, these grand shifts appeared as different voices on the radio, different posters in the post office, different slogans shouted in demonstrations. What did not change were the absences at his table. The cousin shot as a hostage in 1943. The nephew exiled to an Eastern Bloc factory town. The other nephew, whose nightmares woke him screaming after serving in counter-guerrilla units. Modern history books would later describe Greece as the first battlefield of the Cold War, a case study in ideological conflict. For Giorgos, it had been a decade where his country served as a proving ground for other people's plans, where foreign strategies and local hatreds mixed into a war that never truly ended, only sank into the fabric of daily life. When he died years later, his children found the notebook. They read his first line, written in the shaky hand of a man who had watched more uniforms pass through his village than harvests. The Germans left. The flags changed. The guns never went silent. They understood then that the story of their village in the 1940s and 1950s was not one of simple occupation followed by liberation, but of a continuum of violence, from foreign boots to Greek boots, from Nazi proclamations to loyalty certificates, from hunger imposed by invaders to fear imposed by fellow citizens. The guns, in time, did fall quiet, but the echoes remained, carried in notebooks, in scars, in gaps on family trees, long after the world had moved on to other front lines, other flags, other wars.